The director's laughter echoed like glass, breaking in a sterile room, a sharp contrast to the hum of servers. He saw an obsolete relic. The DOJ mainframe saw its only living heartbeat. She didn't argue. She simply pulled the plug, leaving behind a silence that would scream by dawn. The air in the executive suite tasted of expensive ozone and unearned confidence. Director Miller leaned back in his ergonomic throne, his teeth gleaming under the recessed LED lighting like a row of polished tombstones. To him, the woman sitting across the desk wasn't a pioneer or the architect of the agency's most secure vault. She was a line item that had overstayed its welcome. A vintage machine in a world obsessed with shiny new glass. Modernization isn't just a strategy, Elena. It's a survival instinct. Miller chuckled, the sound grating against the quiet dignity of the office. We need visionaries, disruptors. You're the past. A very reliable, very dusty past. Elena didn't flinch. She watched a single dust mote dance in a beam of light, marveling at how easily men built altars to their own ignorance. She had spent 20 years weaving the digital tapestry of the Department of Justice, bearing secrets in layers of code that felt more like poetry than logic. She knew every ghost in the machine, every shadow in the architecture. Miller, meanwhile, couldn't even distinguish between a firewall and a foyer. The past has a way of anchoring the present, Director, she said softly. Her voice was like velvet over gravel, calm, textured, and deceptively heavy. Anchors just hold you back from the horizon, he countered, clearly proud of the cliché. He slid a sleek, silver tablet across the mahogany. Sign the severance. Your terminal access expires at midnight. We've already migrated the core protocols to the new AI-driven Vanguard system. It's faster, leaner, and it doesn't need coffee breaks. Elena looked at the tablet. She didn't see a career ending. She saw a catastrophic countdown beginning. The Vanguard system, he praised, was a house of cards built on a swamp, and she was the only pillar keeping the ground dry. If she signed, the pillar vanished. She picked up the stylus. The weight of the moment felt physical, like the atmosphere dropping before a massive storm. She signed her name with a fluid, practiced motion, the last human touch the DOJ's internal network would ever receive from its creator. I hope the horizon is everything you've dreamed of, she murmured. Walking back to her cubicle, the office felt different. The hum of the cooling fan sounded like a dirge. Her colleagues, mostly 20-somethings with high-fade haircuts and a religious devotion to productivity apps, didn't look up. They were the future, and the future was too busy optimizing its LinkedIn profile to notice the soul of the building walking toward the exit. Elena sat at her terminal one last time. The screen glowed with a soft, amber light, a custom setting she'd kept since the 90s. Her fingers flew across the keys, not in a frantic rush, but with the steady rhythm of a pianist playing a familiar nocturne. She wasn't sabotaging the system. She was simply taking her anchors with her. She executed a final command sequence, system_audit_close. In the digital world, there is a difference between a door being locked and a door simply ceasing to exist. Miller wanted her gone, but he failed to realize that in this particular kingdom, Elena wasn't just the gatekeeper. She was the gate. As the progress bar hit 100%, the amber light flickered and died. She stood up, straightened her coat, and left her keycard on the desk. It looked lonely against the gray laminate. She walked out of the building, the cool night air of the city hitting her face like a benediction. Behind her, the massive glass tower stood glowing, unaware that its central nervous system had just been replaced by a void. By the time she reached her car, she felt a strange, light sensation in her chest. It was the feeling of a heavy burden finally being dropped. Not because she was weak, but because the floor was no longer there to support it. She glanced at her watch. It was nearly midnight. Somewhere in the darkened halls of the DOJ, a single red light began to blink on a server rack. It was a small, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat in a coma. It was the only warning the world would get before the morning light revealed that the modernized future was, in fact, completely locked out of its own mind. The director thought he was cutting the dead wood, but he had actually cut the oxygen line. The silence of the suburbs at 3 a.m. was a stark contrast to the digital screaming only Elena could hear in her mind. She sat in her darkened kitchen, the only light coming from the embers of a dying street lamp outside. She didn't open her laptop. She didn't check her phone. She simply brewed a cup of Earl Grey, the steam curling into the air like a question mark. She knew exactly what was happening 5 miles away in the belly of the beast. At the DOJ headquarters, the Vanguard system was currently eating itself. It wasn't a virus or a hack. It was a fundamental rejection. Without Elena's unique biometric heartbeat, the classified access pulse she had integrated into the kernel years ago, the system viewed every single user, including the director, as an intruder. Back in the server room, the air conditioning began to whine. The cooling units, managed by the very AI Miller had touted, started to cycle erratically. To the machine, the absence of its creator wasn't a vacancy, it was a breach. Every file, every sensitive report, every undercover identity was being folded into an encrypted origami that no one, not even the shiny new visionaries, could unfold. The first casualty was the night shift supervisor, a kid named Tyler, who lived for his senior systems architect title. He clicked on a routine maintenance log and watched in horror as his screen dissolved into a flat, mocking gray. He tried his override code. Access denied. He tried the physical bypass. Hardware locked. "Get Miller," Tyler whispered, his voice cracking in the empty hall. Now. By 5 a.m., the building was no longer a workplace. It was a tomb. The biometric scanners at the elevators refused to recognize fingerprints. The smart glass in the conference rooms turned opaque, trapping a terrified janitor inside room 4B. The building was executing a total passive defense, a protocol Elena had designed for a literal declaration of war. Director Miller arrived at 6:45 a.m., his tie crooked and his modern confidence replaced by a sweaty gray pallor. He swiped his executive badge at the main entrance. The reader didn't beep. It didn't flash red. It simply stayed dark, as if it had forgotten what a badge was. "Break the glass," Miller barked at the security team. "Sir, the glass is reinforced with electromagnetic locks tied to the grid," the guard replied, his face pale. "If we break it, the internal fire suppression system triggers. We'll drown the servers in halon gas." Miller looked at the glass. For the first time, he saw his own reflection. Not as a titan of industry, but as a small, insignificant man standing outside a fortress he no longer owned. The past hadn't just left. She had taken the floor, the walls, and the ceiling with her. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and gold, the first black SUVs from the DOJ review board began to pull into the lot. They weren't there for a meeting. They were there because the Department of Justice had effectively vanished from the global network at exactly 12:01 a.m. Inside her quiet kitchen, Elena took a final sip of her tea. It was cold, but she didn't mind. She looked at the clock. 7:17 a.m., 1 minute to go. She wondered if Miller remembered his joke about anchors. The clock ticked. 7:18 a.m. in the DOJ parking lot. A high-ranking official from the review board stepped out of his vehicle, flanked by 2 stone-faced agents. He didn't look at Miller. He looked at the dead, dark windows of the multi-billion-dollar facility. The report is officially open, the official announced, his voice carrying through the morning chill. Classified access failure. Total system blackout. He finally turned to Miller, his eyes like ice. Who authorized her termination, Miller? And more importantly, where is she? Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The price of arrogance. The digital ghost of the past has just haunted the present, and the modernized future is officially offline. While Miller stands frozen in the silence of his own making, the real story is just beginning to unfold in the shadows. How far would you go to protect your legacy? Dive deeper into the collapse. Join our community of readers discussing the ultimate office revenge. Don't miss the next move. If you want to see how Elena plays her final hand while the world burns in Vanguard's grip, stay tuned. Are you the past or the future? Share your thoughts in the comments. Are you a defender of the old guard or a disruptor of the new? The system is down. The truth is coming. Don't look away. The review board's headquarters wasn't a room. It was a pressurized chamber of redirected blame. Behind the soundproof glass of the observation deck, Miller looked less like a director and more like a specimen under a microscope. The air was thick with the scent of cheap vending machine coffee and the expensive, sharp metallic tang of a cooling system that was no longer doing its job. "You don't understand," Miller stammered, his hands trembling as he tried to gesture toward the darkened monitors. The Vanguard AI was supposed to be autonomous. It was programmed to optimize security protocols. We didn't think she'd tied the entire core to her own presence. You didn't think. The lead investigator, a woman named Sarah Voss with eyes like flint, repeated flatly. That is becoming a recurring theme in this testimony, Director. She circled him, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the precision of a metronome. Elena Vance didn't sabotage the system, Miller. We've had 3 forensic teams look at the snippets of code they can actually reach. She didn't plant a virus. She didn't delete the database. She simply stopped being the bridge. You fired the bridge and then expressed shock when you fell into the canyon. The metaphor hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Outside the glass, the DOJ foyer was a sea of black suits and panicked technicians. They were trying to brute force the locks, but every attempt triggered a more aggressive defensive posture from the building. The elevators had descended to the basement and stayed there. The lights were cycling through a rhythmic, amber pulse, Elena's signature, like a slow, mocking wink from the woman they had called the past. "We can just reset the servers," Miller whispered, though even he didn't sound like he believed it. "A hard wipe. We have backups." "The backups are encrypted with the same biometric key, you idiot," Voss snapped, dropping the professional facade. "The Vanguard system you bought for $80 million is currently treating the backups as unauthorized clones. It's shredding them. It's a digital autoimmune response." Miller sank into a plastic chair. The future he had envisioned was currently a pile of melting silicon and a PR nightmare that would reach the White House by noon. He realized then that he hadn't just fired an employee. He had attempted to delete a cornerstone. Meanwhile, miles away, Elena was in her garden. The soil was cool and damp against her palms as she planted a row of lavender. The world was screaming for her, but here, the only sound was the wind through the birch trees and the distant chime of a neighbor's wind chimes. She had left her phone in the microwave, a Faraday cage for the modern age. She knew they would come for her eventually. They would offer her a consultant's fee that could buy a small island. They would apologize with gritted teeth. They would call her essential, irreplaceable, and the architect. But as she patted the earth over a new bulb, she knew she wouldn't go back. She had spent 20 years building a fortress for people who didn't understand the difference between a lock and a soul. Now, the fortress was closed, and she finally had the keys to her own life. Back at the DOJ, the first classified access failure report hit the Attorney General's desk. The internal clock on the server rack hit 10 a.m. At that exact moment, every printer in the building, from the basement to Miller's executive suite, woke up. They didn't print the classified reports. They didn't print the termination papers. Thousands of sheets of paper began to spill onto the floor, each one bearing a single line of text in a vintage, amber-colored font. System_status. Anchor_removed. Enjoy the horizon. The sound of thousands of printers firing at once was a mechanical roar, a physical manifestation of a digital ghost. Paper cascaded like a dry waterfall, bearing the expensive Italian rugs in Miller's office under a mountain of taunting, amber-tinted ink. The director stared at the words, "Enjoy the horizon," until they blurred into a meaningless smudge. "Get her on the phone," Voss ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Now, I don't care if you have to send a SWAT team to her house to deliver a bouquet of apologies. Get Elena Vance." "We tried," Tyler, the panicked tech lead, stammered as he tripped over a pile of paper. "Her phone is offline. Her home network is a black hole. It's like she doesn't exist anymore." But Elena did exist. She was currently sitting on her back porch, watching a pair of blue jays fight over a crust of bread. The irony wasn't lost on her. The most powerful men in the country were currently being defeated by a woman who was currently worried about the pH balance of her soil. She knew the protocol. She knew that by now, the Vanguard system would be entering its third phase: data hibernation. In 45 minutes, the servers would spin down to prevent unauthorized overheating. The DOJ would go dark, truly dark, for the first time in its history. No emails, no case files, no payroll. A multi-billion-dollar silence. The doorbell rang at 11:14 a.m. Elena didn't stand up immediately. She finished her tea, savoring the warmth, and then walked slowly through her quiet house. She opened the door to find two men in suits she recognized instantly, not by their faces, but by the specific, stiff cut of their jackets. Behind them stood Sarah Voss. Voss didn't lead with a threat. She didn't lead with a badge. She looked at Elena with the weary respect of one professional recognizing another who had successfully burned the world down. "The director is in a holding cell," Voss said without preamble. "Not a legal one, a digital one. He can't get out of his office because the smart locks think he's a threat. The review board has officially stripped him of his credentials." Elena leaned against the doorframe, a faint, thin smile playing on her lips. "He wanted a disruptor. It sounds like he found one." "Elena, the system is shredding the federal witness list." Voss's voice dropped to a low, urgent hum. "People will die. Not in a digital sense. Real people. The anchors are gone and the ship is hitting the rocks. We need the pulse." Elena looked past Voss at the black SUVs idling at the curb. For 20 years, she had been the invisible thread holding the fabric together. She had been the past, the dusty relic, the girl who stayed late to make sure the ghosts stayed in their cages. "I signed the severance, Sarah," Elena said softly. "The terminal is closed. We'll give you whatever you want." Voss stepped closer, the smell of desperation coming off her in waves. "A blank check. Directorship of the entire infrastructure. Immunity for whatever this is." Elena looked at the sky. It was a brilliant, piercing blue, a color she hadn't truly noticed in years because she had been staring at an amber screen. The modern world was crumbling because it forgot that systems aren't made of code. They are made of the people who care enough to keep them breathing. "I don't want a blank check," Elena said, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm. "And I don't want the job, but I'll give you 1 hour of my time." Voss exhaled, a sound of pure relief. Thank God. Let's go. One condition, Elena added, her eyes locking onto Voss's with a sudden, sharp intensity. Miller stays in the office, with the printers. I want him to have plenty of reading material while I work. As she stepped into the SUV, Elena felt the familiar hum of a high-stakes crisis beginning to vibrate in the air. But this time, she wasn't the servant of the machine. She was the architect, returning to her ruin to decide if it was worth rebuilding, or if it was time to let the horizon finally take it. The city sped by in a blur of glass and steel, but Elena felt like she was standing perfectly still. The machine was screaming, and for the first time in her life, she was the only one who knew how to make it sing. The air inside the DOJ command center was thick with the smell of scorched plastic and the collective sweat of 50 panicked engineers. When Elena walked in, the room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. The young visionaries parted like the Red Sea, staring at the woman in the gardening cardigan as if she were a ghost returning to a house she had decided to haunt. She didn't go to the director's office. She didn't look at the mountains of paper. She walked straight to a dusty, neglected terminal in the corner of the server room, the one they had labeled Legacy Input 01. That's disconnected, Tyler whispered, stepping forward. We cut the copper months ago. Everything is fiber optic now, tied to the Vanguard core. Elena didn't look at him. She pulled a small battered USB drive from her pocket, not the sleek silver kind they used, but an old, industrial-grade brick. Fiber is fast, she said, her fingers dancing across a keyboard that clicked with a heavy, mechanical soul. But copper has memory, and I never was a fan of Vanguard's architecture. It was too loud. She plugged the drive in. The amber glow returned to the monitors, but this time it wasn't a pulse. It was a steady, rhythmic thrum. On the screen, thousands of lines of code began to scroll at a speed the human eye couldn't track. What is she doing? Voss asked, leaning over the glass partition. She's not hacking it, the lead analyst replied, his voice full of a sudden, terrifying realization. She's talking to it. The Vanguard AI isn't fighting her. It's yielding. Elena watched the screen. To everyone else, it was data. To her, it was a conversation. She was telling the system that the Creator was home, that the storm was over, and that it could finally stop protecting her from the people who had tried to replace her. One by one, the red lights on the server racks turned a calm, steady green. The screaming fans began to slow. The opaque glass in the conference rooms cleared, revealing a terrified janitor who scrambled for the exit. At exactly 12:18 p.m., the entire building let out a long, mechanical sigh. The elevators chimed, the biometric scanners glowed blue. The system was back. Elena stood up. She didn't check the logs. She didn't wait for the applause that wouldn't come from a room full of people she had just humiliated with her sheer competence. She simply took her USB drive and turned toward the door. Wait, Voss called out, catching her at the threshold. It's all back, just like that? No back doors? No logic bombs? Elena stopped and looked back at the sprawling, high-tech hive she had built. The system is stable, Sarah, but it's no longer modern. I've reverted the kernel to a manual check state. If you want to change a single line of security code from now on, you'll need a physical key. She held up a small iron key, the kind that looked like it belonged to a Victorian library. Where's the lock? Voss asked, confused. In my pocket, Elena said with a faint, ironic tilt of her head. If you ever decide to modernize the team again, make sure you understand the difference between a tool and the hand that swings it. She walked out of the building, past the security guards who now stood at attention, and into the bright midday sun. Behind her, in the executive suite, Director Miller was finally being let out of his office. He stepped over the piles of paper that read, "Enjoy the horizon." His career a smoldering wreck of visionary ambition. Elena didn't look back. She had a garden to tend to, and for the first time in 20 years, the only classified access she cared about was the one that led to her own peace of mind. The past wasn't dead, it was just finally, beautifully, off the clock.